Ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to the YouTube channel grecochess. We continue presenting games that have been completed in the online tournament grecochess that is taking place on the online platform of chess.com. 16 players started the tournament. Now we are in the final round. 4 players remain, and they are maximgovorukha from the Ukraine, Barak 7 from Israel, myskin from Italy, and the Harry, which is myself, from Greece. We have a second game that has been completed in the final round, and we're going to show it to you now. But let's first share the screen with you. As you see, it is Maxim Govorukha from Ukraine against myskin from Italy, with Maxim Govorukha having the white pieces and myskin having the black. And you'll see only part of the screen because we don't want to spoil the surprise. If I show you the entire screen, you'll see exactly how the game continued was completed, with the graph showing who had advantage and where. That's why we're only showing the relevant part of the screen. And on the left side, here you're going to see who the computer thinks is doing better. If you see a number at the bottom left, it thinks that white is doing better. At the top left, it thinks that black is doing better. And with green arrows, you'll see which move the computer thinks should have been the best. And we're starting the game. Maxim Govorukha with the white pieces. Pawn to e4, pawn to d5. This Scandinavian defense. And we're going to read the comments made by the coach, of course, artificial intelligence coach, and they are off the screen that you can see. It says the Scandinavian defense immediately attacks the e4 pawn with a pawn that white can now capture. That's what's happening. A popular response to Scandinavian defense, it helps white control the center, and black, instead of immediately taking the pawn, they place a knight on f6 white. You don't want your queen to be exposed, and then a knight to c3, taking away the queen. Knight f6, says the coach, develops a knight with the idea of recapturing the d5 pawn with a knight instead of the queen. Knight to pawn to d4 for Maxim Govorukha. D4 takes space in the center, controls the e5 and c5 squares, and allows the dark square bishop to develop. That's what the code says. And yes, the knight will take it back on d5. Knight captures on d5, captures the d5 pawn, and places the knight in the center. This is the code. Pawn to c4 and attacks the knight. And knight goes back to b6. Of course, it attacks the pawn on c4, but the bishop on f1 protects the pawn on c4. And knight goes to f3. White continues developing. And myskin will play pawn to g6, preparing to fianchetto the bishop. We completed the first 5 moves, all of them book moves. Computer thinks that white, Maxim Govorukha, is ahead by 0.9, but so long as players play the book moves, this doesn't mean too much. Knight to c3 for Maxim Govorukha, and bishop to g7, yes, completes the fianchetto for myskin. And bishop to e3 for Maxim Govorukha. Until now, you see this little book sign, meaning players have been following book moves, meaning moves established by the theory and have been analyzed exhaustively by great players of the past. This is the last book move for the game. 7 for Maxim Govorukha and 6 for myskin. Myskin will deviate from the book, and knight goes to c6. Good move. Developing the knight and increasing influence in the center, says the computer coach. Pawn to c5. Clearly it's a mistake. Why? When you attack a knight with a pawn, you usually create a weakness. You see the square d5, the knight can easily go there and occupy a wonderful central square. That's why you really need to be very careful in these pawn pushes. And the knight, of course, goes to d5, the correct move to safety, says the coach. Bishop to c4 attacks the knight once again. But these are the one move attacks. Easily defended, especially in games with long controls. And knight takes to c3. The computer coach would rather have the knight take on e3. This is not the right idea, says the coach. First of all, a bishop is usually more valuable than knight, and second, if the knight took the bishop, then white to the recapture with the f2 pawn and create a weakness along the h4 e1 diagonal. And of course, Govorukha will use the pawn to take there, and kingside castling for myskin. We completed the first 10 moves. The difference is very small, just 0.38 for Maxim Govorukha. This means nothing. Kingside castling with Maxim Govorukha and bishop to g4 for uh, myskin. This pings a knight on f3, and some players love it because if your opponent is careless and moves the f3 pawn, or in over the board game, if the opponent even accidentally touches the knight, you win the queen. But this rarely happens. There's something else. With the pawn on g6, if white plays pawn to h3, then black cannot continue the pin. Needs either to take the knight or send the bishop back outside the diagonal. Exactly. Pawn to c3 for Maxim Govorukha. And you see, this star means it's the best move. And also the green arrow agrees with the position. And Myskin decides to change on f3. And Myskin sends a pawn to a3 to a6. Mistakes is a computer. Of course, usually Myskin would think about starting an attack along the queen side. Next move, pawn goes to b5 and attacks the bishop. Not a good move because the white queen could take the knight on c6. The computer coach would rather have the knight go to a5 and attack the bishop. Rook to b1 for Maxim Govorukha. Queen to d7 for Myskin. Bishop to d6 for Maxim Govorukha. This is the opportunity to capture a free pawn, meaning the computer would rather have the Maxim Govorukha capture the pawn on b7. And rook to b8 defends the pawn for Myskin. But computer thinks this is a mistake, and we're going to see what's happening. At this point, both players have completed the first 15 moves, and you see that the small advance, relatively small of 175, becomes 4.88 for Maxim Govorukha. But this depends on the follow-up. Will Maxim Govorukha see the correct follow-up? Once again, viewers are encouraged to pause the video and try to find the next move of Maxim Govorukha. And just to tell you that, yes, he found the correct move. And the correct move is Rook to b7. Brilliance is a computer. The rook was sacrificed. A stunning move. This will win a pawn with correct play. Let's see why it's brilliant. It's brilliant because if Peskin takes back the rook, then Maxim Govorukha will take the knight on c6 and have a double threat. And once the queen moves away, then Maxim Govorukha will take the knight on b7. And queen cannot take back because of the queen on f3. So damage control for Myskin, sending the knight to a5 instead of using the rook on b8 to capture the rook on b7. And of course, exchange of rooks. Maxim Govorukha will keep his extra pawn. But look, now what's happening. The 7th pawn is unprotected. Meaning, yes, there's a king on g8, but you have a double attack. Both a bishop on d5 and queen on f7 attacking. So queen goes to f7, check. And material advantage of Maxim Govorukha is +2 pawns, one of them being the pawn near the king. That's why it's not a +2, but you see +4.8. King to h8, the only move. You see that's what the green arrow means here. In fact, that's not what the green arrow, that's what the white arrow in this gray circle means, the only move. Queen to e6. Maxim Govorukha is ahead by 2 pawns and wants to exchange. And the thumbs up means it's an excellent move. Not the best. The best would have been for the bishop to come there, but very close. We change on e6. Rook to b2 for myskin that is trying to make a counterplay, and we completed the first 20 moves. And at this point, Maxim Govorukha is leading by 4.4. Quite an important advantage. Rook to c1 to protect the c3 pawn. Knight to c5 for myskin. Bishop to d5 for Maxim Govorukha attacks the knight on c6, and the knight goes back to d8. And bishop to b3 for Maxim Govorukha, and he's blocking the rook on b2. The rook cannot go back. But the rook is cannot go back, but has at least one square on e2. Which means that if the king goes to e1, to f1, rook to e1, and bishop to c1, the black rook on b2 could be lost. I've won some games like that. Let's see what's happening. Pawn to d5 for myskin. Bishop to g5 for Maxim Govorukha threatens the knight on f8. Knight goes to c5. Pawn to d5 to c6. Pawn to d6 threatens the knight on c6. Knight is safe on e5 and attacks the bishop on b3. And the pawn continues towards promotion, goes to d6 now. 2 squares from promotion. But of course, the black pawn, my skin from c7, captures the pawn on d6. 26 moves, and the advantage of Maxim Govorukha now is 5.01, and takes a pawn on the next move. And the pawn is 2 squares away from promotion, past pawn, difficult for black to stop it. Bishop goes to h6 for my skin is trying to block the black bishop from diagonal h5 for d8. If the bishop goes away, then the black bishop goes to f6 and perhaps could stop the pawn. Pawn to d7 for Maxim Govorukha. Ignores the threat on the bishop on g5 and continues towards promotion. Knight on c6 for my skin is controlling the d8 square. And now we have the promotion, d8. Still will take it, Maxim Govorukha will win the knight. And e4 for my skin that is trying to see if they have counterplay with the e4 pawn. We completed the first 30 moves, and the advantage of Maxim Govorukha is 5.0. You see here? It's an important one, meaning if Maxim Govorukha does not blunder, Maxim Govorukha wins again. Bishop back to b6, and bishop to e5 for my skin. This means that if Maxim Govorukha is careless and moves the knight on c2, then my skin brings knight to b1 and it's two moves mate. But that's not going to happen. Maxim Govorukha sends the bishop on e3, bishop to g5 my skin, bishop to b4 for Maxim Govorukha, and the bishop on e5 has to be exchanged. You see the pin. It cannot escape the diagonal d4 to h8. And yes, bishops are exchanged, and at this point, with an advantage of 5.0 here, you see for white, black, my skin decided to resign, and this is a win for Maxim Govorukha. But let's see what does the computer think about this game. Let's go to the other screen. What I'm trying to do, and I'm going back and forth, is because I want the entire screen to be shown and not a part of it, because this is the review screen. We want to see everything. Accuracy 93.4 for Maxim Govorukha, 86.7 of my skin, and 2150 of Maxim Govorukha is the rating, and while 1850 for my skin according to the computer. The category is one brilliant move for Maxim Govorukha when the rook took on b7. Best 15 versus 13 for Maxim Govorukha. Excellent 7 each. Good 2 for Maxim Govorukha versus 1. Book 7 versus 6 for Maxim Govorukha. Inaccuracies 2 versus 1 for myskin. Mistakes 3 versus 1 for myskin and no misses to blunders. So this completes the second game. We'll continue with more games. I will present more games that have been completed. Until now, 7 games have been completed. 2 of them ended on movement 1. We're not going to show them, and we're going to show the other 5. This is the second of these 5. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching the video. We'll be back with more games. This is Karelos Aniziris, your host, and the YouTube channel grecochess. For now, goodbye.